The World Bank has recently published its report on fiscal federalism. And today, in this conversation, we are going to have a chance to discuss what that matter is, what the challenges are that Pakistan is facing, and what are some of the strategies and options that the World Bank is recommending. To begin with, in a very simple manner, fiscal federalism, it talks about how resources are collected across the provinces and the federation and how then they are distributed.
Great, yeah, look, I think that people hear fiscal federalism and it sounds pretty dry and pretty boring stuff. It sounds quite technical. And I think the thing to remember about this and why we're talking about this topic is that it actually has very pronounced impacts and very immediate impacts on things that people really care about. It's about whether there's enough money to run the health system and the education system. It's about infrastructure. It's about economic management and whether Pakistan faces an economic crisis, faces inflation. So getting these basic mechanics of fiscal federalism right is really core for Pakistan's development and for Pakistani's prospects. Who collects what? Who delivers what? Who gets what? Critical questions, very political, very technical in some ways, but really with an immediate impact on people's quality of life.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Pakistan and Counting. Today we have a special episode where we've been joined by Tobias Haque, who's the lead country economist at the World Bank for Pakistan. The World Bank has recently published its report on fiscal federalism. And today, in this conversation, we are going to have a chance to discuss what that matter is, what the challenges are that Pakistan is facing, and what are some of the strategies and options that the World Bank is recommending that we take up. So, Tobias, to begin with, welcome to Pakistan and Counting.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here tonight. Good to see you.
Thank you for joining us. To begin with, in a very simple manner, fiscal federalism, it talks about how resources are collected across the provinces and the federation and how then they are distributed. And these days, of course, the conversation around the NFC Award, the National Finance Commission Award, is of course very hot and heated and hotly debated. Would love to have you explain to our audiences in very simple words what the NFC is, and according to the NFC, how does this state of Pakistan and provinces, how do we collect resources, and on a very high level, how do we distribute them?
Great, yeah, look, I think that people hear fiscal federalism and it sounds pretty dry and pretty boring stuff. It sounds quite technical. And I think the thing to remember about this and why we're talking about this topic is that it actually has very pronounced impacts and very immediate impacts on things that people really care about. It's about whether there's enough money to run the health system and the education system. It's about infrastructure. It's about economic management and whether Pakistan faces an economic crisis, faces inflation. So getting these basic mechanics of fiscal federalism right is really core for Pakistan's development and for Pakistani's prospects. The system we have at the moment, as you say, is structured around the NFC, and we had a major constitutional amendment, the 18th constitutional amendment, in 2010. And around the same time, we had the last of the National Finance Commission Awards. And the combination of those two reforms essentially decided that much more of the service delivery responsibilities in Pakistan should be taken on by the provinces. So essentially all basic service delivery became provincial mandates. It also decided who should receive tax revenues and who should do taxation. So the federal government's role was limited to company taxes, personal income taxes, and the sales tax on goods, whereas the sales tax on services was pushed down to the provinces. And the provinces are also able now to collect taxes on agriculture, taxes on property. And then the NFC was responsible for distributing the money that the federal government collected. And what we saw at that point was a sharp increase in the amount of money that the federal government was obliged to push down towards the provinces, right? So essentially, what this 18th constitutional amendment and the 7th NFC did was say who collects what, who is responsible for doing what, and how should we divide up the resources that are collected by the federal government between the federal function and the provincial function? So who gets what, right? So who collects what, who delivers what, who gets what? Critical questions, very political, very technical in some ways, but really with an immediate impact on people's quality of life.
Let's begin by maybe we decide, maybe we start in reverse order. We start talking about who spends what and who gets the money. So let's say 100 rupees are collected, right? What how much of that 100 rupees is being collected currently by the federation? How much of the 100 rupees are being collected by the provinces? And for now, let's just simplify. Tax is tax, whether it's income tax, whether it's sales tax, whether it's other forms of taxation. Let's just lump it together. How much of that 100 rupees does the federation hold, and how much of that is going to provinces? And then we'll next tell us by what formula is it decided who amongst the provinces gets what.
Great. I mean, so excellent question. I mean, at the moment, we have basically the federal government still collecting the vast majority of taxes. So if you look at Pakistan's total tax take at the moment, around 13% of GDP. I'm just using rough numbers, right? And then the amount collected by the provinces is only between 1 and 2%. So that leaves 11 to 12% collected by the federal government. Obviously, this varies year by year, but those are the basic numbers. So 90%-ish of revenues are collected by the federal government. Of that amount, 57.5 that the federal government collects then has to be redistributed into what they call the divisible pool, which is pushed out to the 4 major provinces. The provinces are also collecting their own taxes, as I say. And those taxes are quite limited, and that reflects the revenue handles that they have available. So they can collect from the sales tax on services, they can collect from property taxes, agricultural taxes, fees and charges. But the reality is that the provinces are very heavily reliant on these transfers from the federal government. So around 90% of provincial spending is financed by transfers from the federal government. So the federal government plays the key role in collecting, and then it pushes out to the provinces, and the provinces play a significant role in spending, but they're really dependent upon these transfers from the federal government.
We'll come back to provinces not collecting the taxes that they can collect and relying. But before that, let's say 100 rupees is to be divided between the provinces and primarily the 4 large provinces. What is the formula according to which the divisible pool, as you explained, that out of 100 rupees that the federation has, 57.5% has to now be distributed amongst the provinces? How do we decide what Balochistan gets, what Sindh gets, what Punjab gets, and so on?
So the way that is decided is through the National Finance Commission formula. And the National Finance Commission is it's a formal body that is constitutionally mandated. It includes representation from the federal government and the provincial government. And it has its mandate is to decide exactly these questions. Its mandate is to decide how much money from the divisible pool is distributed among the provinces, and how that funding that goes to the provinces should be shared between them. And that is informed by a formula which has to be negotiated and agreed by consensus among all parties, all participants in the National Finance Commission. At the moment, we have a fairly basic formula which puts a very heavy emphasis on population. And so the National Finance Commission's responsibility is to determine both how much of the divisible pool goes to provinces and how it is shared out between the provinces. And they are mandated to come up with a formula to determine this distribution between the provinces. And right now, that formula is based on some quite basic indicators. So the majority determinant is population. So about 82% weighting is based on population. Then there's a weighting for poverty. So about 10% based on poverty. So poorer provinces get a higher weighting so that you have a redistributive aspect to this. A very small proportion, about 5%, is based on revenue collection. And the idea there is that provinces should be rewarded for collecting revenue by getting a larger share of the divisible pool if their revenue collection performance is strong. And then the final aspect is what they call the inverse population density formula. Essentially, what that means is that if there is a very sparse population, if you're in a Balochistan or a KP where the population is further spread out, there is some compensation for that. But the weighting of that is only about 3% of the formula. So at the moment, it's not doing a lot of work in the formula. And I think while we have moved away from the purely population-based formula that we had in the past, population really still is the key determinant of how much each of these provinces get, with the most populous provinces getting the lion's share of the distribution.
And what is wrong with that? Now, let's just simplify that you have 100 people in the country, 60 people are in one particular province, so it makes sense that the lion's share of expenditure goes to those 60 people. On the other end, one could also make the argument on the inverse population formula, because if the population is sparse in let's say Balochistan or KP, in this heart of Punjab, you could create a few massive hospitals and some dispensaries, but in those far-flung areas, you'll have to do far more smaller interventions on the infrastructure. So, on one end, you could say that the provinces that have poverty, they should be given more resources so they're able to emerge out of poverty, and the ones who've done better in the past should subsidize. On the other end, you could say that if it's $1 spent to achieve GDP growth, better spend it where there is already the wheels of the economy are running, so you'll get a higher return. What is the right answer? And at the bank, you guys work with what 100 plus countries. What is the right answer generally, and maybe what's the right answer for us?
Look, I think that's a great question, and I don't want to be a cop out, but what I would have to say is I don't think there is any right answer, right? And I think that different countries have different solutions to this problem, and often it is very political. I mean, this is actually a political decision that needs to be made by policymakers, by people who are accountable to their citizens. So I don't think we would ever say that there's one specific technical solution. But let me lay out some of the issues. I think that one of those issues is that if you're basing it purely on population, and it's the point that you made, you may not achieve equity, right? A more populous province may be a wealthier province. The more populous provinces may have larger cities, they may have a larger productive base, they may be able to collect more revenue because they have a larger population. So for all of these reasons, are you using your divisible pool to benefit those who are already better off at the expense of those who are worse off? So there's that equalization aspect, right? There is this, I think, a general principle that horizontal distribution of the divisible pool between the provinces should promote equity in some way, right? It should be about making sure that people have access to roughly the same level of services while facing roughly the same tax rates. And that's important for national identity, it's important for people's sense of equity, and it's also important economically as well, right? You don't want some provinces falling behind because they're unable to pay for the basics. So there's that part of it. I think the other part of it is incentives as well. And what a lot of countries do is that rather than just say, we're going to base your payment on how large your population is, they say, we can use the distribution of the divisible pool or their equivalent to incentivize good or positive behavior, right, from provincial governments. That sounds a little paternalistic, but I don't think it is. It's not about saying that the federal government should be telling provinces what to do. It's about saying that sometimes there are collective action problems that require consistent and coherent action between provinces and between within each other and between them and the federal government. And by using your transfers, by using conditionality on those transfers, by using performance metrics on your transfers, you could encourage provinces to take actions that benefit the entire country. What might some of those actions be? Well, I mean, you could look at, for example, provision of basic services. So the provinces that are doing better in providing health and education could qualify for an additional payment, an additional block grant. You could design it so that those provinces that are performing well in collecting taxes gain a larger share of the pool, so that you are incentivizing rather than disincentivizing provinces to go out and collect their own taxes. And you probably also want to be a little bit careful about the incentives that purely basing your distribution on population creates. Because essentially what that means is that the populations that are growing faster will obtain a greater share of the revenue pool over time. And that may not be the right incentive, especially if, as Pakistanis, people are concerned about the rates of population growth, and there's an intention to bring that population growth downwards over time. So you can use your horizontal distribution. You can use these distributions from the federation to the provinces, firstly, to achieve some level of equity, some level of fairness in terms of access to services, in terms of what the government can provide and what people expect of the government, within a context within which people are paying roughly the same amount of tax. So that's objective number one. And you can combine that with a more targeted system, which provides additional incentives for provinces to achieve national goals, whether that's around service delivery, whether it's around management of the environment, whether that's around revenue collection, right? So it's that combination of things in getting that balance. And many countries have done that using different solutions and different approaches. But I think our basic message would be having such a heavy weighting on population is a missed opportunity to both achieve equalization and to create the right incentives.
And of course, if you distribute with a formula that is very simplistic, based just on population, as you said, there is no guarantee that equity is being achieved. You may even be giving the same amount of money per capita to each province, but and when you mention services, but the quality of education services or health services or sanitation services or other key citizen services like energy infrastructure may not be the same. So you may be distributing, and this is where another topic comes down, which is about the responsibilities. So in the 18th Amendment, there were certain responsibilities that were also devolved to the provinces. For instance, education and healthcare were devolved to the provinces. So in some cases, the federation is still doing a lot of expenditure on education and healthcare, and the provinces are supposed to run primary education, and to some extent even secondary and tertiary education is now devolved. But every election season, we see discretionary funding going to MNAs and MPAs, who are then going and constructing hospitals and universities, the OPEX for which the federation doesn't have. And in a way, it's taking away money which could have gone into building basic clinics and basic primary schools into provinces. And also, the quality of schools and hospitals may not be same across the province. So we've devolved the powers of having more money, but there is no accountability of those services, particularly education and healthcare, which were devolved. So how do you rationalize this?
So, well, that's a good question. And I think that that's one of the key points that we raise in this report, right? And this gets into these broader issues around macroeconomic sustainability. What we saw with the 18th Constitutional Amendment was a lot of responsibilities being pushed down to the province. And then we saw a lot of the federal revenues also being pushed down to the provinces. So we saw this sharp increase in the amount of funding into the divisible pool. That was money that the federal government could no longer spend, right? So their responsibilities shrank, but their resources also shrank because they were required to give more money to the provinces. Unfortunately, federal government spending did not shrink, right? So we did not see that consolidation in federal spending, and federal spending remained actually quite consistent despite it no longer having so many responsibilities and despite it no longer having as much money. The natural result of that was that you saw an increase in the fiscal deficit. It's very observable. So the government's deficit went into the red, right? The government's balance went into the red. The federal government went into the deficit because all of a sudden it was giving away a lot of its money to the provinces, but it didn't stop spending money. And that, I think, is a key issue that really now needs to be resolved, because what we've seen ever since is these quite consistently high fiscal deficits, and the government's had to borrow money to make up the difference. So now we've seen public debt really increase quite sharply. We're now at 75% of GDP at least. And the cost of sustaining that debt is now very large as well. So every year the government is spending 6-7% of GDP just on servicing its existing debts in a context where the entire government is only collecting around 13-14% of GDP, including the provinces, in revenues. So we have a real structural problem there, and that's a key point of the report, is that what we need to do now is make sure that the federal government is not spending on things that are unnecessary, and that the federal government is not duplicating the functions that have been pushed down to the provinces with the 18th Constitutional Amendment. There's actually an exercise underway in government at the moment. They're calling it a federal government right-sizing process, where they're looking at all the government ministries and they're looking at the areas where they could cut spending, because the provincial government should be taking on that mandate. And the provincial government should be taking on that spending responsibility. That exercise is in the early stages, but I think there's hope that will lead to some consolidation of federal spending, and that will address some of these issues that you mentioned. And it's not just spending either, it's also the number of federal government civil servants. If you look at the number of federal government civil servants, it hasn't declined since the 18th Constitutional Amendment. So what we've seen is an expansion, essentially, of government, rather than a transfer of government spending and civil servants from the federal level to the provinces. We've seen an expansion of government, with the federal government remaining at the same scale as it was, but much greater resources and much greater employment now taking place at the provincial government levels. There's not necessarily anything wrong with having a large government, but you certainly don't want it to be doing the same thing, duplicating itself, and having this blurring of responsibility with multiple parts of government fulfilling the same roles and no clear sense of who is responsible for doing what.
Tobias, where are the biggest overlaps? Which segments of the I know we already spoke about education and healthcare. These were two big topics that are fully devolved now. So in large aspects, there shouldn't be an education and healthcare department at the federal level, or if there is some sort of an administrative service for education and healthcare, maybe it is to do for federal employees. But besides that, where are the biggest overlaps, and which are the most obvious federal government functions which are not needed anymore?
So, I mean, I think it's a very complicated question, because, as you say, there isn't necessarily a hard rule here that there's no need for a federal government Ministry of Health or a federal government Ministry of Education. There's still a need for a federal ministry that provides the national level strategy, that provides the national level policy. You look at the Higher Education Commission. You can look at various areas where there is arguably a national level mandate that should be fulfilled by a federal government. This is what you see in federal governments around the world. Any federal system, you would typically still have a national government with a federal government that fulfills those national functions. The question is how big that function needs to be, how much money that federal entity needs to spend and how many people that federal entity needs to employ. And I think that that is what we need to take a look at. And that really requires going under the hood and looking at the line items in the budget, looking at where money is being spent, looking at where people are being employed, because you can't just say, look, well, health is a devolved topic. That means we no longer need a health department, or education is devolved. We no longer need a federal education department. It's not as simple as that. And that's why we need to really get into the details. But I think one question that really does come up and is very complex, that adds to this complexity, is around the social protection system as well. And what we've seen is real growth in the federal spending on the BISP system. And by all accounts, social protection is meant to be a provincial function. So there is now federal spending at significant levels, between 1% and 2% of GDP, on social protection. And that has largely accounted for some of the growth in federal spending since the 18th Constitutional Amendment, one of the biggest areas of growth in federal spending since the Constitutional Amendment. That's not necessarily a bad thing either, because maybe it makes sense to have a national system for social protection. The same system everywhere, using the same the IT systems, the same processes, the same registry for citizens to qualify for that benefits. So there may be an argument to have a single national system that is run by the federal government, but I think there's a big question there about who should be paying for that system. And I think a real potential opportunity would be for the costs of that system to progressively be shared more and pushed further down towards the provincial level.
I want to put a pin on BISP and sort of come back to who should be doing a social protection system. But before that, can I try to nudge you one more time and ask, or should I, or do you wanna do a well left here, and or should I ask you one more time that if we were to say, okay, here are the 3, 4 functions which are the most bloated on the federal level, given that the responsibility and the fiscal space has been pushed down to the province, what would those be?
Yeah, no, look, I honestly think you'd have to get into the ministry. You would have to do a functional review. You'd have to say, look, who is doing what? Where are the people? Where is the spending? I think it would be risky to kind of make a blunt call based only on the name of the ministry. I don't think that would be the right way of doing it.
Coming back to BISP, and maybe we could go one by one on education, on health, on BISP, and a few other topics, and sort of game what should sit where. Now, one argument could be that the provinces should be delivering social protection in form of direct subsidization. Maybe the other challenge, the reason why it doesn't work for now, at least in my humble understanding, is that the federation has made itself the end all and be all of price setting. So the petroleum price is the same from Karachi to Peshawar, and that's a federal government decision. The power rates are the same based on each slab across the entire country, even though the cost of petroleum may be a lot less in Karachi than in the north. And similarly, uh, we're finally out of the support prices in wheat and sugar. But otherwise, when the government is determining the price of wheat and sugar support prices on a federal level, it again is determining winners and losers in the market. So in that situation, when the government is sort of the puppet master of the marketplace, then naturally the federation becomes responsible for also caring for those they leave behind in this system. So, can we make an argument that till we untangle, till we privatize, till every province stands on its own feet in terms of different tax rules, where I, as a corporate or as a citizen, as an economic citizen, can choose out whether I want to live in this province or that province, or if my industry needs more fuel, I should be in south where it's cheaper, whereas being in north where it's more expensive, and vice versa for other stuff. So free market economy, I guess, on one side, and social protection on the other side, and these aren't disconnected. Would love your comment on that.
No, look, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, The last thing I would ever suggest is that Pakistan doesn't need a social protection system,
It
and
certainly.
we certainly do. And I think that, as you say, the need for that social protection system is amplified by a system in which the economy is managed in a way that doesn't create as many jobs and as many opportunities and as much income for the regular citizen as it should and as it could. Right. So I completely agree with what you say there. And in terms of, whether the federal government kind of has an obligation to pay for that, I think that really is a question about fiscal management overall. I think what we have at the moment is a system where the federal government is running persistent deficits, as we've said, and that's leading to very rapid increases in debt and very high debt servicing costs. And we've seen Pakistan on the verge of real fiscal collapse almost over recent years, right? I mean, I think there was a real perceived risk of default. So it doesn't actually benefit anyone to have a federal government that is facing that level of fiscal risk, right? It doesn't benefit the federal government, obviously, but also we're all in this together, right? Whether you live in Punjab, whether you live in Sindh, whether you live in Islamabad, if the economy goes through a macroeconomic crisis, if we have the kind of inflation that we've had in the past, if we've had the kind of devaluation that we've had in the past, everybody is harmed from that. And I think this comes back to the point we were making earlier, right? Around the idea that what the NFC should really be about and what fiscal federalism arrangements should be about is about having a mechanism to achieve shared goals nationwide. And I think in this context, we can argue about whose fault various economic dysfunctions are, and we can argue which level of government should be responsible for fixing them. And we certainly have views on that, right? I'm not saying we don't have views, but regardless of the answer to those questions, at the moment, the real need is for us to reduce some of the fiscal pressures on the federal government. And that may mean shifting some of the spending burden to the provincial governments to take on the slack where they can, right? Now, having said that, I think that any shift towards reallocating spending, further spending to the provinces or pulling back resources to the federal government should be preceded by an exercise where we look very carefully, as we've said, at what the federal government's actually spending money on, and making sure that there isn't any waste, and making sure that the federal government is spending money in the most efficient way possible. Only once we've done that, can we say, well, look, we now have a federal government that is spending efficiently, there isn't a lot of waste, and we still have this gap, and we need to fill that gap. And then you have to think about, how do you fill that gap? And really, you only have a couple of options. I mean, you can fix the tax system, and I think we've been working to fix the tax system for a long time. That's a whole additional topic, and we need to progress on that. But I think that there's a recognition that will take some time. So that's one option. Option two is that you then say that, well, what we're going to have to do is push more responsibilities down to the provinces. And I think, as I say, the big line item there is probably social protection. I think it makes sense for us to have a nationally coherent and perhaps even federally administered social protection system, but perhaps the provinces could pay a greater share in the financing of that system. And then your third option is to say, well, the federal government should hold back some of the resources that are currently being shifted down to the provinces. And there's various ways you could think of doing that as well. I mean, one way you could think of doing it is to say, well, look, when the federal government is providing a genuine national public good, whether that's social protection or debt servicing or national infrastructure, some of the costs of doing that should be excluded from the divisible pool. So you can make a deduction from the divisible pool, the amount of money that's shared with the provinces. You could say, before we share that out to the provinces, we're going to take some amount of that to pay for the national public goods that the federal government is still providing. Look, if Pakistan achieves decent rates of economic growth, if we manage to expand the tax system, we can ease these pressures, right? We can get to a situation where we can afford to meet the fiscal needs, and we can pay down the debt and we can reduce these debt servicing costs. But that's going to take some time. And the point is that in the medium term, when the federal government is so resource constrained and is facing so many demands, it doesn't actually help anybody to have this kind of fiscal pressure.
And of course, the fourth part, which is the provinces can also raise their own taxes, right?
Exactly.
And what has been happening is that the formal services and industrial sector and the formal salaried class, whose tax administration is done by the FBR, who pay income tax, they are overtaxed. Large corporations, especially corporations who do capital value creation, create conglomerates, are now effectively taxed at 65%. If you are a salaried professional, anything above, I think, 4 million or 5 million or something, you're paying 35%. That basically means anyone who's reasonably qualified after a certain income level has an incentive to leave the country and go to the Middle East or wherever. Whereas when we look at agriculture, when we look at services, when we look at real estate, the provinces are simply not collecting. You always see this imported ex banker finance minister standing there and talking about fiscal deficit and tax collection. But never have you heard a chief minister mention the word tax. They'd rather keep their voters happy. They'd rather that the federation keeps borrowing money as long as they. How will we change this? At the moment, the way currently the NFC is structured, the chief minister has no incentive but to go and ruffle the feathers of the landowners, the guys who run shops and markets, the person who runs the clinic, the person who runs the beauty parlor, or the person who has taken so much agricultural land and converted it into housing societies. And we're seeing this across all provinces. So how do you fix that?
So this is a critical question, and I think you've put your finger on it as well. That if provincial governments, as they are resourced 90% from transfers from the federal government, they have very little incentive to increase their own revenues. They're living comfortably on the transfers that the federal government is providing. And the political costs of trying to raise taxes are very high, while the marginal benefit of raising provincial taxes is relatively low because it only accounts for 10% of your financing. So what do you do about that? And I think this is where the strands of our conversation come together a little bit, because I think what other countries have done, and I think what there's a lot of potential for Pakistan to do, is to increase or find ways of incentivizing increased tax collection through the design of their National Finance Commission Award, through the design of their fiscal federalism system. In that case, what you could say to provinces is that, look, yes, we'll provide you with some base level of federal transfer for equalization, for the provision of basic services. But if you want to gain more federal resource, you have to meet certain targets in terms of either tax collection performance, or at least in terms of the adequacy of your tax systems and processes. And you could have a framework of incentivizing that kind of policy action. So that's one approach that could be taken, is actually designing the NFC in a way that incentivizes. The other thing that I think really we haven't talked about yet is also this option of streamlining the design of the tax administration system itself. Right? At the moment, we have excise departments at the federal and provincial levels. Every province has its board of revenue. Every province has its revenue authority. Right? So you have the GST collection, you have the land tax collection, and you have the excise tax collection. 3 entities, and then you have that at the federal level as well. So you're dealing with something like 15 agencies collecting taxes in Pakistan. If you're a taxpayer, if you're a business that's operating in each of the provinces, you're submitting, for every tax return period, you're submitting 15 tax returns. So the administrative burden here is potentially enormous as well, by having split the tax base between the entities so finely. And so I think that another solution that comes up in these discussions of fiscal federalism is whether it would make more sense to say, let's reunify some of these bases. Let's have maybe a single tax collection entity that is responsible for collecting all taxes at the federal and at the provincial level. Maybe it makes sense for us to say, let's have the GST on goods and services collected together, which is what most countries in the world do. It's very unusual to split your GST on goods and services. And what you could have is some kind of formula which says, okay, we're going to collect GST. We're going to have a single federal agency that collects GST from everybody. That means one tax return, one set of tax rates, one set of tax rules, much easier to do administratively. And then they'll distribute that revenue out via some formula between the provinces, right? So we've kind of got the in some ways, the worst of both worlds here, right? Where we have a tax system that does not adequately reflect needs. It does not distribute revenues in a way that reflects needs. But we've also managed to slice and dice our tax handles so finely and spread them out across entities and across geographies that we have both the low tax performance that comes from a very fragmented tax system and the misalignment of revenues and needs, right? So, and I think there's so many options which would deliver a better result, both in terms of making it easy to pay taxes and equalizing revenue flows with what is needed.
It's also creating multiple classes of economic citizenship. So if you are a salaried professional living in Karachi, you're paying north of 30% of your income as taxes. Then you go out and consume in a formal store, right, like a Carrefour or a Nahid supermarket, where then GST is being collected on your consumption, and then you do banking transactions or fintech transactions, and you are also using your mobile phone and internet on which you're also paying taxes. Then you have a TV, a cable connection for a television on which you're also paying taxes. So effectively, you're paying close to 40 to 50% of your total income in some form of tax because the federation is collecting from you. Whereas if you are, let's say, an agriculturalist centered in Punjab, there is practically, you've never interacted with a federal revenue agent, or, I mean, the total tax paid last year by salaried class was in excess of 500 billion rupees, whereas for the entire agriculture sector, it was not even 10 billion rupees. And not only that, so not only do you not pay tax, the province that you belong to also is getting a higher share of the final distribution of the tax because by sheer virtue of population. So it's also creating unequal incentives for different citizens. And how did other countries who were in similar situations reconcile? And we've discussed different options, right? One is the federation cuts the amount that it distributes. The second is we change the formula a little bit. Maybe we, in the formula, we added 25% weightage for who collects how much tax. A third could be that the federal government itself cuts its own overlapping expenses. The fourth is it pushes down the expenses for some services, like you said, whether it's debt burden or it's the Benazir income support program. But eventually, how do you get the provinces to be responsible for collecting tax? Because right now, they're taking all the political benefit of not going out and collecting tax and leaving the federation, which is collectively everyone, with more debt. How do you get out of this?
No, so look, I mean, and I think there's only one solution, and it's a solution that is very well known. We have, we've done very well. We've expanded the number of taxpayers over the past few years, and we now have 7 million personal income taxpayers in Pakistan. 7 million of a country of 250 million people. So if 7 million people are paying the personal income tax of a country of 250 million people, you're never going to have an equal tax system. You're never going to be able to finance that country's needs in an equitable way, because that tax burden is so concentrated on such a small group of people. And because we can't collect taxes from personal income tax or income taxes in general, that forces us to rely on these GST and the sales tax. And that is a very regressive tax, because it basically means that we have to 18% standard GST rate. That means the poor person in a village is paying 18% tax on the basic necessities of life, right? So we need to expand the tax base, right? We need to have more people paying tax. And yes, there's lots of things that the federal government, the FBI, can do and that they're working on in terms of digitization, in terms of improving the operations of customs, in terms of HR improvements and so on, to bring more people into the tax system as personal income tax filers and payers. But just as you say, the real potential, the real untapped tax bases are real estate, agriculture, and they are the mandates of the provinces. So the provinces have to come in and pay their share. So how do you shift those incentives? And I think it has to be some combination of saying that uh, there has to be an incentive built into the National Finance Commission Award. And there has to be perhaps a sense that the federal government just can't keep paying for so much of what are these national public goods, because the financing is just not there. It's not available for the federal government. Now, I think there's also a broader conversation here, right? Which is that how much can you fix through the NFC Award? How much can you fix through the fiscal federalism arrangements? Is there a broader discussion that needs to be had at some point at the very political level, which is essentially saying we need to kind of change more fundamentally the rules of the game and have a broader sense of national unity and national purpose to get the economy growing again. So I think you can shape the fiscal federalism arrangements, you could shape the NFC to create the right incentives, and that's what we need to do. But I think perhaps the broader political conversation that also needs to be had about who's going to be responsible for meeting the fiscal needs of this country when it comes to service delivery.
I think that's the bridge to be crossed, right? I think we know which federal organizations need to be right sized. I think it's there in plain sight. We know that the tax contribution from the formal sectors and salaried class cannot be grown. In fact, some relief needs to be provided there. We know that some burden needs to be passed back down to the provinces. And the provinces also argue that why should we take the burden? The federal government is bloated. So both have to happen at the same time.
Exactly.
But eventually, for this equation to add up, the provinces need to collect more. If you could go a little into specifics of both the carrot and the stick over here, that what could be some clampdowns, that okay, if you do not collect, you don't get ABC, or the other structure is that if you collect more, you get XYZ out of it.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I think that we have two problems. We have two constraints to deal with, right? The first constraint is that the Constitution, the 18th Constitutional Amendment, says that the amount of money that is pushed down to the provinces, 57.5% of the divisible pool, that funds can never be, that ratio cannot be reduced. So no NFC, no measure can be taken under the Constitution to reduce the amount of money that is pushed down to the provinces, right? So it's constraint number one. Constraint number two, you need to make sure that and this is not actually what the Constitution explicitly says, but this is the convention, is that any NFC award needs to be reached by consensus. Now, if you combine those two facts, what you have is a system in which the amount of money that goes to provinces cannot be reduced, and that they all need to agree to any changes to the way that revenue is shared. And that puts a lot of inertia into the system, because the nature of that arrangement is that if any province wins, if any province's share is going to increase, another province's share is likely to have to decrease. And the federal government certainly doesn't have spare money to send down to the provinces to pay them extra to increase the divisible pool, right? So that's not an option. So we're in this zero-sum situation where anyone's gain is going to be someone else's loss. And I think that's when this discussion around revenue sharing and the design of the National Fiscal Commission Award has to shift beyond a negotiation for maximizing the revenue share of each province. And I think that, frankly, is how it's been approached to date, right? It's been seen as representatives coming together and their interests in that negotiation being, we need to maximize the revenues coming to our province. It's not going to work, right? Because that is a zero-sum game. The game theory just means you're not going to reach an agreement, because any proposal is going to have winners and losers, and any loser has the right to veto that proposal. So I think we need to shift the terms of the discussion. And the shift in that terms of discussion has to move from being fighting over comparatively limited revenue amounts to saying we need an economy that is growing. Pakistan needs an economy that's growing, and not at 3%, but at 7%. Pakistan needs an economy in which we don't have 40% of children stunted. We need an economy in which 80% of children can read and are performing well within the school system, rather than having 80% of children that cannot read an age-appropriate text at the age of 11. We need to recognize that these are national challenges. These are collective challenges that are doing just as much harm to the provinces as they're doing to the federal government, because we're all living here. We're all living in Pakistan, right? So how do we kind of change that mindset so that NFC is no longer seen as a zero-sum game and a competition over resources, to being a mechanism through which we can come together and say, look, how do we create a system that allows us to address our overriding national challenges? And those national challenges should be, as we've talked about, it should be, how do we create a system in which this NFC, this fiscal federalism, allows us to raise more revenue? We're not going to survive on 12%, 13% of revenue as a share of GDP. It's not enough, especially when we're paying 6 or 7% of GDP purely in servicing the debt, right? So number one. Number two, how do we get services to work better, right? How do we incentivize the delivery of services? How do we create a system in which there is an incentive for performance and the delivery of services and access to services? And number three, how do we create a system in which there is an incentive and systems that encourage the provision of basic infrastructure that allows the private sector to grow and the economy to thrive? If we thought about it that way, the gains from sustaining 5 or 7% growth over 10 years are so much greater than being able to get another percent of the divisible pool this year, right? I mean, it's orders of magnitude greater gains from resolving the collective action problem than winning the competition over the scraps.
Thank you so much, Tobias. And if you allow me, I'd like to just also summarize in Urdu for some of our audiences that जब NFC का मामला है, इसमें जो दो अहम शिकें हैं जिसकी बुनियाद पर NFC आपस में उसूल चलते हैं, वो एक तो ये है कि जो 57.5% का शेयर है प्रोविंसेस का 100 रुपए में से, वो बदला नहीं जा सकता। और अगर कोई भी तब्दीली की जाएगी NFC में आगे जाकर, वो किसी भी अगर एक फरीक ने उस पर अग्री नहीं किया तो वो अग्रीमेंट नहीं हो सकता बगैर कंसेंसस के। अब या तो जो विफाक है वो अपने खर्चे कम करे, लेकिन अगर वो 1 रुपए का खर्चा कम करती है तो उसमें से 57.5 रुपए प्रोविंसेस को चले जाते हैं। अच्छा, अगर एक प्रोविंस अपनी स्पेंडिंग, अपनी रेवेन्यू को इंक्रीज करती है तो उसको उसका प्रोपोर्शनेट शेयर वापस नहीं मिलता, बिकॉज जो इस वक्त NFC की डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन है उसमें कलेक्शन की परफॉर्मेंस का कोई वेटेज नहीं है। वेटेज अभी भी सबसे ज़्यादा पॉपुलेशन का है कि जहाँ पर पॉपुलेशन ज़्यादा है वहाँ पर नेचुरली जहाँ इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटी ज़्यादा है वहीं पर आगे भी मज़ीद ज़्यादा डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन होती जाएगी, पर के जो इलाके पसमानदा है और कम पॉपुलेटेड है वहाँ पर बाय डिफ़ॉल्ट फॉर्मूले के तहत कम ही पैसा जाएगा। But to sum this up, what Tobias has said, that we have to simplify things. We have to simplify our tax code. Instead of having 15 organizations, we have to reduce them to one or two, simplify the tax code, simplify the tax rates. We cannot survive if only 7 million people are paying 13% of GDP. But if we were to fix and grow the overall pie, Tobias, this is the message I'm taking away from you. If we grow the overall pie and start growing the economy at 6 to 7%, then we won't be fighting. These will be academic numbers.
That's 100% right, Junaid. Exactly. And I think that hopefully that is the attitude that and the approach that we take as we go into these NFC conversations. And it really becomes about what's best for Pakistan overall.
Let's hope so too. And thank you for this timely report. I hope our viewers, we're going to put this report's link in the description. We really encourage you to download this report and read it. We will also we've already also released the video which explains the contents of this report. And essentially, the NFC in so many ways is the economic social contract that ties the whole country together. And I think we have to see it, as Tobias said, not as my gain is your loss or your loss is my gain, but what can we do to collectively grow the pie? That is Pakistan. Thank you so much, Tobias, and to all our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you so much.